Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the Man at YouTube with another model video. Today we're going to be doing a bit of theory and talk on putty, something I've been meaning to do for a while, and I thought the best way to do it is show the range of putty I've used in the past or currently used. Generally I find that you generally reach into something that fills seam lines, small imperfections, nubs, gouges and whatnot, and from there you try other things and fulfill other goals that the putty that you use just for seam lines does not quite cut it. The type of putty you'll also generally tend to attract to is what you're able to easily acquire locally at your hobby shop or around the place. We'll just have a look at each of them, how I use them, why I use them, how I find the effect to be. A lot of uses of these putties can also be found in other videos and tutorials, looking up things such as sculpting, some of the kit bashing, scratch building, articulation videos, work in progresses, as well as anything that has to do with filling seam lines and reviews of the individual products. First, the most easy to find, Tamiya basic type putty. It is a grey, almost paint-like paste. It applies with a toothpick, brush or Q-tip. I prefer Q-tip along any sort of gouge or panel line, or not so much panel line, seam line. It does have a bad habit and tendency of shrinking, so light applications after being sanded away will need to be reapplied as it can sink into the seam. Though if you have a tendency of filling the seam with some sort of super glue, or it's very tight, it works quite well. If the kit is a bit loose and the seams are pretty wide, it has a tendency of struggling, so heaping an excess amount on, then sanding it back will generally do the job. If you are heaping a large amount on, or there's lots of detail either side of the seam line, applying masking tape on either side of the seam, applying the putty and lifting it has a tendency of protecting detail. The putty is also very soft and sands back very easily and can be re-scribed afterwards. Once the putty is applied, you should allow easily 24 hours to dry before sanding. This is a putty I stand by and do not mind besides the shrinking component. I do not longer use it as a seam line putty, but more so applying it over the total surface thinly to create a cast iron or a damaged effect for armor, tank, robots and such. There are other products you can get that generally performs a little better than this, but if it's the only thing you can get, it is sufficient. Squadron green or white type putty. There is arguments between the two that green is a far more coarse texture or filling ability and white is more smoother. I find them similar besides the colour. It does have a very strong odour and recommended to be used outside or with masks due to health complaints according to the United States. Very easy to be bought in America or the UK. Bit trickier for Australia. It has the same application and use as Tamiya basic type putty. It appears in green or white. Apply with Q-tip, brush or toothpick along seams or gouges or small imperfections like injector pin marks and whatnot. Again, like the Tamiya putty, you can't really heap it and fill large crevices or extremely wide gaps. Pretty much just your seam lines that after they've been glued together. What has an advantage over Tamiya is it's a bit dry in application and it does not shrink as much, if not at all. So the amount that you apply, it's going to sit at that level and be sanded off quite easily. You do also still have to wait 24 hours after application, and I recommend putting a little super glue down the seam line and allowing that to dry before putting this on. It's fairly soft, very easy to scribe, very easy to sand back. If you don't want to clog your sandpaper or file or whatnot, you definitely need to allow adequate time to dry, the 24 hours. If you are building a very detailed model, again, the trick with the masking tape also applies. It does not cover a whole surface as well as the Tamiya in creating a cast iron or any sort of armor effects due to its ability of skinning or drying faster. Tamiya is able to be thinned with lacquer thinner and applied to be a lot thin. This also has the same ability, but will start to shrink as you add thinner. Mr. Hobby Dissolved Putty is also fairly useful in covering seam lines. If your kit seems to be more modern, very tightly fitted, glued, and a bit of super glue applied over. Heaped up, this is sufficient in applicating and sanding back. It has a crazy fast dry time. Can be applied with a Q-tip or brush. It applies very, very smoothly, and it has many different applications in fixing faults, fine scratches, seams, and gorges. Though because it is in an almost paint liquid-like state, it is not very effective in large gaps or hollowed areas. I find it to be very useful once you've used Squadron or Tamiya, sanded that back and used primer. If you have any sort of imperfections left behind, this is good for a second round or a second covering, as it has a much finer and smoother tendency than its rougher counterparts. It is very similar to Mr. Surfacer 500 in its microfilling ability. Generally, it is not easy to thin it or pass it through a conventional airbrush, where Mr. Surfacer 500 can. Unlike Mr. Surfacer 500, it does not really shrink. It can be thinned with lacquer thinner. Has a bit of a pungent odour. Definitely recommended to be used in small doses outdoors or in a well ventilated area. I like to use it in conjunction with Squadron in filling seam lines, especially if you're trying to achieve a high gloss finish with no faults or imperfection, and you can virtually start sanding it within hours of application without issue. This thing is definitely your best friend when it comes to modifying, kit bashing and scratch building. When you add primer and see the tiny or thousand of little faults of bubble holes, putty not contouring to a surface, little gaps, creaks, cuts or holes, that will make it into a contoured single surface in one or two applications and being sanded back. Its biggest disadvantage is it's extremely soft even after being fully cured, so using a very coarse sandpaper will rip it up or add holes. When sanding back, stick to about 300 grit sandpaper and higher. What's very safe would be 500-600 and higher. That won't really do any damage and become very smooth. For the other two sandpapers, generally anything goes, as they are far harder after drying. We're now going to a much lower velocity all the way to solids. Milli Putt is a very solid putty in two parts, epoxy based. This is more of an industry general use than a modelling one, though made very popular among sculptors and wargamers alike. You cut two equal proportions from the sticks given and mix it thoroughly until it creates a standardized color. There are a few color types, grades and whatnot at various costs. the standard seems to be the most sufficient and quite strong and easy to stick. Its uses are generally filling small voids, very large gaps or holes where seam line filling putty doesn't quite cut it, damage to models, as well as scratch building, modifying or building up depths or volumes to surfaces. It is a tad more advanced to apply, but very useful. You don't really pinch or mess with the shape or the composition of the two sticks, as that sets off the chemical process and will harden over time. You generally, once open, have a 2-year shelf life to use up before it goes off and you have to buy another one. But if you do enough modelling, that shouldn't be too much of a problem. It also does have applications in automotive, plumbing and whatnot, so a little maintenance around the house to finish the stick is okay. It applies dry to a surface by pushing it on. If you don't want it to stick, such as making a push mold or contouring it to another surface to stick, pin or glue later, you wet it. When you applied it to a surface and you want to smooth it out, it's simple as adding water to your fingers on the surface and smoothing it out. It can become quite pasty and almost liquid. It takes about 24 hours or a little longer for it to fully chemically harden and set when the two surfaces are mixed together. It holds its shape very well, so sculpting is possible, mold making is possible, casting from those molds with a release agent is possible, filling voids, reinforcing sections as it's very strong. The possibilities are endless. If you can stick it, sculpt it or force it in an area, it definitely has an application. Once fully dried, hardened and stuck to a surface, it can be tapped, drilled, cut, sawed, sand, scribed without issue. It is a little harder than plastic, but sands very easily to a very smooth surface. Once you sculpted it onto a surface, you can generally use Squadron or Mr. Dissolved Putty over it to make it contour and uniformed with its existing surface and sand back. It's very easy to paint. It's a very creative medium. As far as your imagination goes, you can do it. The best thing to do is buy some, very cheap, around $5 to $10 depending on where you are around the world a stick. The other types can be more expensive, but generally this is good enough. Buy yourself some, have a play, see how you can add it to models, scratch building accessories, or even better, elevating dioramas and other fun jobs. There's no real wrong way of using this product. If it sticks and it works to you, that is good enough. You'll see in a lot of my work in progress, especially for Gunpla Builders World Cups, in many applications of using this from dioramas to the main model. This is epoxy 2-part putty known as green stuff or blue stuff, made popular among wargamers through Games Workshop and Citadel. You cut a bit of that strip, mix it together, turns into a solid green colour, and you've got about 20 to 40 minutes to play and sculpt to hold its shape. It generally is just as easy to work as Milliput, except after it sets, it's a far more softer material, softer than styrene, so it's very easy to buff, sand, and very smooth to spread out and contour to a surface. It sticks very well. Same rules apply. When wet, doesn't stick as well, but it becomes quite smooth and you can smooth it out even more sufficiently. It has a bit of flex. Milliput's biggest disadvantage is it's very rigid, and if applied very thinly will generally crack and have problems. This stuff can be applied very thinly and is really good for making things like capes on figures or dust covers in joints of robots or tanks or whatnot. Really having a playing with the two mediums will give you an idea of how easy it is to work with. Unlike Milliput, it doesn't have a shelf life and can survive indefinitely as long as you don't mix the two surfaces together. This tape stuff has a disadvantage that the very center will generally fuse into a hard surface. If you're doing a large sculpt, it doesn't matter. If you're doing a very thin sculpt and don't want lumpy shit in it, it's best to just cut about 1 millimeter of the center out. It can come in 2 large tubes, but that could be a little hard to decan. It's up to you if you want it in tape form or tube form. Do not buy it from hobby shops. Definitely do not buy it from Citadel. They have a tendency of selling it in 6 to 12 inches at exorbitant prices. Having a look through engineering firms, no-name brands, bulk or on eBay, will find that you can find large tubes or large strips of the stuff from the United Kingdom or United States very, very cheaply, and generally in further bulk, heavily discounted. If you've got a collection of friends, it's ideal to buy as much as you can and spread it out. To get an idea how to use it, definitely have a play, look at some work in progresses. A lot of the wargaming guys have just got brilliant ways how to use it as a texturing agent on surfaces and making zimmerit or a wood type texture, making little rivets, purity seals, mechanical detail, organic detail, tentacles, the list just goes on. Also, due to its ability to flex, it has its uses in gunpla. It sticks to soft vinyl and hard vinyl. Great for modifying toys, repairing toys, working on soft vinyl models. That would be good for filling seams and whatnot, as some of the solvent-based seams in seamline filling at the beginning of this video will have adverse effects on soft vinyl. A very fun putty, definitely highly recommended. Again, even though it starts to harden and firm up after 45 minutes, it needs about 12 to 24 hour time to fully harden before you start sanding or handling it without changing shape. Armature inside it through wire gives it a little more tensile strength, and once fully hardened you can cut it, saw it, drill it, all that sort of stuff. It's just a bit softer than Milliput. Now getting into your Tamiya epoxy putties, Mr. Hobby epoxy putties, all that sort of stuff. They have a normal, a quick type, which is shown in video, and an extra smooth type by Mr. Hobby. They are more upmarket, far more expensive. They're very high quality and very similar to Milliput. They generally to be very, very smooth in application. Can be manipulated and great in creating detail, and excellent as a sculpting medium, and should be used as a sculpting medium over filling voids and whatnot. It is very worthwhile playing around with. I find this one has the advantage of flexibility like green stuff, but it hardens as nearly as hard as Milliput, and almost has an equal amount of sanding and scribing probability as styrene. So as you're sanding the two together, one's not going to wear out faster than the other. Again, worthwhile being played with. It is an epoxy putty. It's got the same rules as all the other ones. It can be used for making molds. It can be used for all the other stuff. I generally would use the Milliput for all the cheap, nasty bulk work, and then the finer detail work with this stuff, the rare amount of times I do use it. It's my to-go putty for toy repair, mechanisme, and GK kits. It's really, really, really fun stuff to use. Just be careful of how you save it with how much you'll be paying for, and see if you can source it overseas in large quantities. The larger 100 gram packs seem to be a lot better than the far smaller ones in the way of price. Generally, that's the two strips or colors, cut equal amounts. mix them together, and then you have an operating time of 20-30 minutes. And this stuff, generally you can start cutting and sanding in 12 hours, but if you're after painting, a lot less, a few hours, and it's hard to the touch, and you can sort of, carve it a bit and whatnot. And that's why I like to use it for more quicker builds. The extra smooth stuff and the sculpting stuff is really brilliant if you're right into the whole figurative or making your own GK kit scene, or very natural type purposes. We also have the Tamiya, or there are other hobby brands, 2-part polyester putty. This is when we're using more resin models. The seam line filling Tamiya basic type or squadron has a lot harder ability to adhere to a smooth resin surface. Polyester is pretty much another type of resin and fuses on quite beautifully. It's a bit hard to mix, especially with a tiny amount of the hardener and a large amount of the putty. It has the worst odor of all of them. It should only exclusively be used outdoors, and if you mix it incorrectly, it dries far too slowly and doesn't cure properly, or far too quickly. If you do get a good consistency, it takes a little practice. It is very smooth and beautiful to apply on your gaps and seams and whatnot on your resin models. Can be used on styrene, but I wouldn't bother due to its difficulty, hard to source, and price. You can buy traditional polyester putty for automotive work in much larger quantities cheaper, but mixing that in larger quantities does have effects on your health. Definitely do it outside. Definitely wear a respirator while doing it. When it hardens like a resin, and when sanded will give you the same health issues with free airborne resin particles. Wear a mask or do wet sanding. I used to use the Tamiya stuff. I have no longer use it, as I found another alternative for resin. Blade or automotive bog putty is also polyester based. I generally decant them into a very small Tamiya or Mr. Hobby size container. I apply it on resin, and on rare occasions putty and styrene with a Q-tip. It also applies beautifully, as well as pre-mixed polyester putty. The advantage of polyester putty is after application it dries solid hard in a matter of hours mixed correctly, and you can start sanding and cutting into it immediately. It has a tendency of being a bit softer than resin. Blade putty dries quite hard. It is a lot slower and needs 24 hours, though with easy application to both styrene for seam lines and poly or resin, it sands, it cuts easy. It's very, very good to use. It's very easy to find in hardware or automotive stores in 250, 300, 500 gram tins. The smell seems to be very pungent when cracked open, so just decant them into little containers. Use them when they run out, re-top it up. Should be almost a life supply. They have a tendency of thickening up over time. They can be thinned down with lacquer thinner. They do have a tendency of shrinking a little bit, so you just heap up a little more than you need and sand back. It generally is a really, really, really good cheap alternative to Squadron, Tamiya basic type or polyester putty, and saving a fair amount of money as long as you're mindful of your health. And I also do enjoy it in fixing imperfections with scratch building. The last is timber or wood putty. I exclusively use it for dioramas. If I have a flat surface and I want to elevate it a bit to have hills or slopes or whatnot, I get the pre-mixed putty, mix it with a bit of PVA glue. It doesn't stick to surfaces too well. Mixing it with PVA glue makes it stick to surfaces a lot nicer. I sculpt it with various tools such as sticks, paddle pop sticks, Q-tips and toothpicks until I got a shape that I really like, and I leave it to dry. When applied, this stuff is designed to be applied very thinly in between grains or gaps in wood, and that dries very quickly. When it's in larger masses, it has a tendency of drying a lot slower and cracking. So if you're building a diorama, allow a lot of time. Build your elevate. If you can elevate further with a fill material underneath, like cardboard or layered styrene or something, and put a thinner layer of putty, that is definitely an advantage. Allow it 2 to 3 days, or in bad weather even up to 5 days, to dry and harden. Cracks and very deep and wide cracks will appear. When that hardens, it can just be refilled with this again, and it won't crack anywhere near as much with a lot of PVA mixed in. You can create sawdust or sand or other things and mix it with this to use it as a filler and give it more bulk and strength. It does shrink, but if you add a filler or even baking soda, it won't shrink as much because it's really binding another material. And realistically, mixing it with a sand or something means you don't have to add PVA glue and sand on later, as it's already embedded in the surface. There's no wrong way of doing it. Realistically, this is my own personal cheap method of building dioramas that I thought of when I was quite young, and I sort of still practice to this day. It isn't that easy to sand cut or whatnot, but if it's just elevated terrain, you don't really need to do any of that sort of stuff. And it's just a lot of fun. Have a play with it if you're keen. You probably should have some of the pre-mixed or mix yourself stuff floating around somewhere. Can be thinned down with water, but generally the thicker the better, so look at thickening it up. So these are the putties I've used or used in the past. How I've come to the conclusion, besides looking at tutorials, talking to friends and whatnot, I started with a seam line filling putty. Tamiya or Squadron filled seam lines. As that did not fulfill my needs in its ability to shrink or fill large areas, I got Milliput. So with one stick of Milliput, one stick of Tamiya, that realistically should cover most of your jobs. But as you require more products, they're worth buying, worth trying and testing and adding to your repertoire or inventory of different products at your disposal for different styles, methods or needs in your modeling. Some people may need more than this. There are other products such as light curing putty and other multi-parts or aspects that you might find useful for your style modeling. They're worth buying, trying out and testing. There are also putties on the market that are not so good. I would avoid the Citadel liquid green stuff or anything by Vallejo, as they have more heavily shrinkage disadvantages, or they just have a poor chance of adhering to a model. If you do find use for it and make it work, definitely power to you. I don't like to diss products if they're useful in someone else's toolkit. Have a play, see how far you go. If you can find cheaper alternatives in a hardware store or whatnot, they're always worth having a look at and a test before you apply to your models. Thank you very much for watching. As always, until next time, stay tuned for further content with uses of putty. As long as it does not affect your health and you do not damage something, there is no wrong way. Have a play. Check out Facebook for work in progresses, more news and further content. We have other links to interesting content or resources around. Don't forget to have a bit of a peek at the description bar in each video for probably more potential content or references. References can sometimes be important when information is given. If you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer them in the comment section or other platforms that I happen to be lurking around, as well as personalized help in private message. Modeling is my thing, and I just enjoy talking about it and helping people out. Let us know if this model or video was of any use to you or not. Catch you guys next time.